Welcome everybody to this week's Griscom stream. I'm broadcasting to y'all live from a beautiful day here in Austin, Texas. Hope you are doing well wherever you are. For folks who are unfamiliar, these are kind of more weekly informal streams. Going to go through a couple different stories and concepts that I've been sort of working through. This is an interactive stream, so feel free to jump into the chat. I'll be watching that. And we always appreciate super chats, especially here at Left Reckoning. It's hard for us to keep this YouTube channel functioning. We don't make much money from our ads or anything like that, so super chats are very much appreciated. Also, this week's episode is going to be a real good one. First up, we're going to have Council Member Shama Sawant on to talk about the corporate funded movements trying to recall her seat in Seattle. She has been incredibly influential at fighting for working people in that city, and also as a national figurehead of what kind of working class politics, socialist politics can do. So really looking forward to talking to her about that, and also her opinions on the kind of state of the left that we're in today, because we definitely are entering into a new chapter, and hopefully it's one that will be rich with left-wing and socialist organizing in this country. But we need to make sure that we're getting straight and working really hard and thinking through problems instead of just reacting to things. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And if you needed anything else to get you excited for Thursday, we're also going to be joined by our good friend Big Waz, Wozni Lambre. Longtime friend of us over at TMBS. He's doing a great work at The Athletic. We're going to talk about a little bit about basketball, but also some kind of general politics stuff, because I know some of y'all need that as well. But we're really looking forward to this show on Thursday, so definitely check that out. Thursdays at 8 Eastern, 7 Central. So that'll be a good one. And also, as I was saying last week, we're working on these kind of more theory-based special episodes for patrons, which we're hoping to be able to start our work on our first one on James Connolly very soon, and we'll be releasing that for patrons. So again, if there are any other folks or thinkers that you want to see us cover on Left Reckoning, be sure to reach out. Even better if you have any suggested guests. The idea with those is just going to be, we're going to talk about thinkers and their kind of general biography, but we really want to have it set up in a way where we're talking about folks, who have influenced somebody and their work, and why they think that work is important to them today, right? But very much in like a kind of practical socialist theory sense. So people have really enjoyed, for example, on this channel, us talking about Leo Panitch, right? And some of the analysis and lessons that we've learned from him and his work. We want to continue to do that with other thinkers as well, and also bring in more and more guests to talk about that, which I'm really looking forward to. Being able to jump onto that. And thanks so much to Mugwort for the super chat there. We really do appreciate that. Well, I want to get to some questions and stuff like that, and there's a few things I'm going to talk about today. But let's start. There's a couple so basically the three big stories I'm going to be talking about is what's going on at the border, because there is straight up manufactured consent. Consent being manufactured going on right now when it comes to immigration in the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a bit, and I also want to talk about politics and will, because this has been a little bit of a theme of the question of Left Reckoning, but I'm seeing this analysis continue, to pop up, and sometimes it's from people we don't really consider to be socialists, people who consider themselves to be kind of progressive or anti-establishment or whatever. And I just want to set the record straight on this question about will and politics, because obviously our individual attitudes and dispositions do affect our political work, but it's really important that we don't mistake the kind of weakness of the left, and also the way that the system functions, as just a question of cruelty and lack of will from the opposition, because there are serious structural factors, and that's not an escape, or that doesn't allow people to get away with blame or anything like that. It's literally just understanding what the playing field is, so that we can defeat our opponents, because we are not the first people to exist to think that this system is wrong and that we want to be living in a different society. What our real task is, first, of course, like getting that realization, but then understanding how to build politics that can get there. But we'll be definitely we'll be getting to all that in a second, but feel free to jump in with some questions and super chats. I wanted to start with this insane story, though. I usually don't like to do this kind of this kind of stuff because it's so absurd. But one, it had to do with Austin and gentrification, and it really infuriated me. And I'm sorry I'm not doing our typical streams. I can't share my computer with y'all, but yeah, I don't think there's any way for me to do that with the way this is set up today. But I wanted to share with y'all this insane story about that was in Texas Monthly that came out earlier today, called "They Just Moved into an Austin Neighborhood. Now They Want to End One of Its Traditions." And it's such a classic story of like PMC and upper middle class white people's bullshit, and the damage that they do to communities, not just like economically, but also culturally. So this story basically is about an area in East Austin, right? For folks who aren't familiar with this city, that's traditionally had been a more like Tejano, Mexican American and Black community in the city, and certainly a working class one as well. That has really been extremely gentrified over the past few years, and we're almost like at like second level gentrification at this point, right? But despite all this, there has been, continuation of, basically car clubs where people show up, with their souped up, cars and things like that, and hang out, drink beers, play music, slab and things like that for folks who are familiar. Well, these people have been basically doing this kind of car club, get together, drive their cars around, cruise, drink beers, play music. Have been doing it like since the 90s. Have recently started to get the police called on them by these new residents, these people who just moved into Austin, particularly East Austin. But most notably has been the influx of calls from an apartment complex called The Weaver. And it is one of those complexes that if you were to look it up, it is exactly the kind of dystopian neoliberal hellscape architecture and style of building that we all cannot stand. I wish I could share these photos with y'all, but you can check it out, weaveraustin.com. And, you see this, one of these kind of like completely curated, spaces, which basically means, bleached of any kind of culture, or rootedness in this community. But this isn't the first time that a bunch of rich people have moved into a neighborhood and have started harassing the people who have made that neighborhood a great place to live in the first place, right? What is so frustrating about this story is that some of the people who've been calling the police and were interviewed by Texas Monthly on this, they located their opposition to these get-togethers again, of like Black and like Tejano folks in Austin, the people who made this city a great place to be. They rooted their criticism in like SJW talk. And what do I mean by that? One of the people interviewed, let me see if I get this quote exactly right. One of the people interviewed said that, here we go. They were basically, Texas Monthly came around and said, like, okay, why are all these people calling the police on a gathering that's been going on every Sunday for decades and decades and decades? One Weaver resident voiced a more generalized criticism of the event, calling the event a display of toxic masculinity. We should shut this thing down, a third resident, who blamed the lack of police response on the idiotic city council's decision to slash the Austin Police Department's budget, wrote in March on a building forum, right? And then you also have other people who are trying to frame their opposition to these folks in environmentalism, right? Say, oh, it's not good to have all these cars around for the greens, right? For the trees and things like that. Just endlessly disgusting. And it's something that it's worth noting as it continues to happen. Obviously, this is not unique to Austin. This is happening all over the country, but it is really incredible to see that merge of this kind of like progressive speak to do the oldest, nastiest activity that rich white people do, right? Which is to call, the police on people just having a good time and living in their communities and living their lives, right? And it's really shitty that all these people have now been equipped with this like language and this vocabulary to obscure their real motivations, which are they don't want people like that in their neighborhood, right? A neighborhood that they, I'm talking about the rich, wealthy folks who moved into this terrible complex, just ugly. You should see. It's just like one of these terrible places that's completely curated, and they build those up so poorly that they're all going to be tear downs in like 15, 20 years. But they also charge people like $2,000 a month for like a 600 square foot, apartment. Just disgusting, disgusting stuff. And that got me really worked up today. And I'm trying to, to get back to talk about other things, but it's like, it's hard to see. I don't know. It's definitely just, it's gross. And it's funny because that's a place too, that has really just had so much of its like local culture ripped out, and the fact that folks are still able to enjoy it and participate in that is a beautiful thing. And we just have to push back against these people, both like politically and economically, but also culturally. I think too much of the conversation about gentrification, gets framed in a way where it seems like only like a cultural problem or like a behavioral problem, right? Where it's like, oh, the problem with gentrification is that like the new people like don't know how to act, and that's 100% true, right? When you're seeing what you're seeing, it's a very fair to say, why the hell did you move to a neighborhood like that if you want to oppose every aspect, of that neighborhood, its history and its culture and its people, right? 100% reasonable criticism, but the problem there. If we focus too much on that, we will miss the fundamental question, which is a question of money and economics, and the fact that there is nowhere in this country where you can afford to live, even if you're making a shitload of money. Like, I mean, relatively, I'm saying like a normal person, a good amount of money. I mean, these people who are living in the apartment are paying like $2,000 for a shoebox apartment, right? It's absurd on its face. And we just want to make sure that we're not letting developers get off the hook because of a bunch of Karen asshole morons who also need to be put in their place. But the bigger factors here are the developers, the cities that allow this kind of nonsense to happen and continually, fail to provide public housing. But obviously that's going to start with the federal government, which in this country has absolutely decimated public housing. Public housing is not just something that we wish for. It is a human right. We should be building up as much of it as possible, the best quality stuff as possible, and moving as much of, one of life's most basic necessities, house, right? Being housed, out of the private sector, because not only does it produce shitty ass places like this Weaver building, I'm telling you, check it out. It's ugly as hell. It also does a very bad job at providing answers to these massive social problems that we have, which is mass displacement. And it also just suffocates, vibrant communities. All right, y'all. Let's see if there's any questions that I missed. I have all these other things to get to, but I'd like to take some questions today. I know I've been sort of going off the past few ones. Richard says San Jose, California got rid of the Cinco de Mayo parade. PMC's techies can ruin everything. I know, and it's one of those things that's like, I don't understand why you want to live in a community like that if you oppose everything about it. It just came to the top of my head. So, I might be getting the title wrong, but there's an interesting essay I read a few years ago about what they call like Nowhereville, which is like this kind of structure that it's, it's like the, definition of pornography. Like, when you see it, it's like, those coffee shops that it's like, they're the exact same in Sydney, Australia, or Portland, Oregon, or, Laos, right? Like, they're all over the world. They've created these kind of like curated white spaces, and they pop up everywhere for this kind of global traveling elite, to go to all of these different places around the globe and then essentially sit in the exact same kind of structure. And that is unfortunately what we're seeing so much of. It's sad to see. You see similar kind of structures in Philadelphia as you do in Brooklyn or in Seattle, and it's something that, this is like, there are way worse crimes of capitalism. But sometimes I get a little sad thinking about, man, if when we do, get more power and we're able to provide more and more for folks, and to try to build up a different kind of architecture, and architecture for the people, we're going to have to do a hell of a lot of work to undo what's really been done in the past 20 years. These kind of like just this terrible kind of neoliberal buildings. Absolutely. Oh yeah, and thanks, Anna, for reminding me about this. Make sure you catch Dave on the Jackman Show tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern. Now, I'll be guest hosting the Jackman Show. We'll be joined by Jason Miles of the Our Revolution podcast. I've been on his show a few times. He's a good time. We're going to be talking about music, talking about socialism and music. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. It will definitely be a fun one. I'm going to talk a little bit about I'm thinking Chris Christopherson. We might talk a little about Steve Earle, but it's gonna be a fun one. Definitely don't forget to check that out. And yeah, Matt Faint says, do they do a flat white at these like nasty little neoliberal coffee shops? I'm sure they do. All right. Well, if there's no questions, I'll get to this other story about the border, because this is also something that is extremely upsetting to watch. And it was one of those things that we knew. Remember how loudly all of anytime you try to criticize Biden or Harris, or hell, even Obama, you got, just attacks from like centrists accounts going on about, no more kids in cages, and basically any criticism of Biden and the Democratic Party was only allowing the continuation of this horrific border policy. Well, now we are pretty early into, we're early, we're have a decent chunk of time into the Biden administration, and we are not seeing a kind of mass movement from the Biden administration's policies regarding immigration to I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. The Biden administration's treatment of immigration. And I think that this story right here, and I'll get to Patrick's question in just a second. I want to make sure that I cover this really quickly, because it's important. So first of all, we've seen this uptick of border stories on cable news. Like last weekend, if you were to watch like what they call the Sunday shows, which are like the big talk shows, political shows, almost every channel was doing big stories on the border, right? In the border crisis. And they're talking about how, there are, world historic numbers of folks coming in. And there is a trend towards more folks who are trying to cross the border right now. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that, Biden is not just such an overt psycho as Donald Trump was when it came to the border and to immigration. But again, these are not these world historic numbers that they're trying to make them out to be. There's plenty of other historical precedent for large numbers of people coming into the United States, and it's nowhere near any kind of when you talk about other countries that have like serious influxes of like immigrant populations. The United States is such a big country, such a big population, and geographically such a big country as well. It really, if you were to compare it to any other country, it's not that massive. But these stories and this focus on this is really important, because let me pull this up, and I'll see if I can figure out next week how to share my screen with y'all. because this is a wild story, and I want to make sure y'all can check it out afterwards. But Marcia Brown in the American Prospect did a story called "Did CNN Air a Staged Migrant Crossing of the Rio Grande?" And it's telling this story about how a CNN reporter, somehow stumbled across a massive group of people crossing over the Rio Grande River, right? And almost immediately, immigration activists and other folks who've been covering that area have been basically making the point that this 100% looks doctored. And some of the points that they note are very interesting. One, it's not typical for huge groups to cover the river like that. Two, it's an incredible coincidence that this huge group of people was crossing the Rio Grande, and CNN just so happened to be making a planned visit to that area. And some of the other things were very interesting. In that video, traffickers were wearing ski masks, which you typically wouldn't be doing because you want to blend in with the group. Because if you get, arrested or detained, you want to just seem like you're just another migrant and not somebody who could be, held liable for trafficking, right? And it's worth noting that the Border Patrol for a very long time has been staging these kind of PR events. They constantly show up on right-wing media. And in this case, they're showing up now on outlets like CNN. It's 100% something that is very frightening. And I think the reporting here and the arguments in this piece in the American Prospect are very sound, that this looks like it's staged. The question is CNN stupid enough that they fell for like sea-level Border Patrol propaganda? Or were they complicit in this, for ratings, right? Regardless, it needs to be noted that there is a media campaign and a PR shift around the question of the border. And it's very interesting to see all these folks who 6 months ago were crying about the inhumane conditions of the border start to grow very silent about that aspect and start to focus on, oh no, now all of these people are coming over, right? It's a very subtle shift, but it's a very significant one in what that is actually going to mean for all of these human beings who are just looking for safety, right? I'd also add too that the Border Patrol is ramping up its efforts. They have been very upset about what we're calling the Biden administration has basically what they're calling an unofficial gag order of media and of reporting of the facilities around the border in Texas, right? There's no doubt that they don't want information to be coming out into the public right now because they are holding a lot of people in detention facilities, right? This is, again, another example of, PR warfare, right? And we're seeing it from the Biden administration in tandem with the Border Patrol. And one thing has to be noted: the Border Patrol, in a lot of ways, is a rogue agency, right? So painting a picture of line and foot and foot in sync step between the Biden administration and the Border Patrol would not be accurate. But they are both playing a political game to try to hopefully, Joe Biden's case, to put everybody to sleep on this issue, and in the Border Patrol's case, to enrage the right-wing base and hope that liberals, start to sit down and shut up because now their blue guy is in the White House, so they don't care about the issues at the border anymore. This is something that we're just going to have to continue to highlight and to fight and to bring up and to support groups on the ground who are fighting against these inhumane conditions. But it's really ridiculous to see how quickly. I mean, we're in March. We're only a couple months into the Biden administration. How quickly, all these people who 5 months ago were obsessed and were constantly talking about the inhumane conditions on our southern border now are very silent and are making excuses for it. Right? Like, there are some things that are complicated, right? And aren't easy to, overhaul, right? But the worst and most egregious aspects of Trump's border policy can be undone very quickly by the Biden administration, particularly the insane and disgusting legal system where you have children being forced to go up in front of a judge and explain why they are seeking asylum. Oftentimes, more than the general rule here, not being able to speak the majority spoken language in the United States, which is English, right? Being forced to come up with a legal argument for yourself in these contexts is extremely brutal and extremely inhumane. And that is something that the Biden administration could deal with this afternoon as we're speaking right now. And they still haven't, right? So there's not much more to say other than, let's keep on this. There is certainly an effort right now to paint a narrative to make it seem like all of the crazy things that we're going to see reported over the next couple of weeks are only, we're calling it just because there's some kind of historical migration to the United States. That's not true. They're trying to, create conditions where that they can make excuses for a very critical part of the system of American imperialism, which is having an extremely hard and brutal border. All right, let me all right, I'm going to come back and let's do some questions. So let me start with this first super chat from Patrick Stevens. This is, can you briefly go over the IMF and the World Bank and how they operate on a global scale? Well, it's interesting to know because, first of all, these are two institutions of extreme, globalization, right? And you see, right. So you see that like on the macro level, on the political level, on the geopolitical level. These institutions. So let's start from smaller things and get to the larger thing. These are organizations that do a lot of important research, and that's something that's worth noting. That you can get really. Not always. I'm not, this is not like an endorsement of the entirety of those studies, but they get really smart people to study trends in the global economy, working at both of those institutions. So they come out with some reports that can be very beneficial. And it's been interesting to see, whatever we're talking about is this new era that we're entering into, some shifts from the research that's coming out of those organizations. But that's sort of, honestly, unless you're somebody who's like me, is like trying to keep up with that stuff, that's probably not of much interest to you, right? The IMF is basically works to, this is like how they would sell themselves, right? To maintain a kind of to maintain like stability within our monetary system, right? International monetary system, because you have to understand before you had the Bretton Woods Agreement, things were quite, anarchic, right? And there are a lot of issues. You can't have a global economy without having some global systems that are managing those, right? Functionally, what that has meant, though, is both the World Bank and the IMFs are arms of imperial power to try to not only fulfill that mandate of trying to make sure that the system, the international monetary system is functional, but to implement a hegemonic policy, right? So like the hegemony that like we're living through right now in regards to the IMF is neoliberalism, right? So they get involved in coming into into countries who need help, need loans, and then the IMF will come and say like, okay, well, here are all of our suggestions of things that you need to do, right? So you can get this, but you also have to deal with these stipulations. The World Bank, is supposed to be an institution that is supposed to help out low to middle income countries develop. But you don't have to look very far to see the track record of that. These are institutions that if you were to like lob a critique at them, I think it's better to start and to think about them as as institutions, like the problem with these institutions is not that they're big. The problem with these institutions is that they serve a role of promoting free market ideology and free market capitalism. They serve a role of protecting the interests of the wealthy countries over the small, right? They might say they want to do different things, but we have seen what development has meant, right? For the third world. You talk about the amount of money that comes into Africa through loans and aid, right? International aid and through loans actually is less than what gets extracted from the continent of Africa, right? That is a continuation of imperialism, right? It's just the form has shifted. And it's very much worth noting that these institutions also wage war on publicly owned assets as much as possible. Part of what, when they give suggestions to countries, part of their modernization is almost always, all right, sell off anything that's publicly owned. Yeah. And, probably you're going to want to sell it to the French or the Americans or the English because they're the people who have the most money for it, right? Like those are the kind of suggestions and the way that those institutions implement their neoliberal capital in like a concrete way. Let me Jacob, actually, this is on the same boat. Jacob says, thoughts on the recent escalation with China. I mean, it's something that you see when it comes to Joe Biden, this administration. It's not some radical break with the previous politics of this of even Trump. In fact, they're doubling down. They're trying to. I mean, you saw what Biden was doing during the election when they were trying to basically paint Trump as a stooge of China, much like liberals did the same thing with Trump when it came to Russia. And made him out to seem like, oh, Trump is just taking orders from Putin. When Trump's like nastiness and just willingness to be belligerent and to tear up any kind of international agreements only enraged our tensions with Russia, which is not something to take lightly at all. But to speak more, about what's going on with China, what are the forces that are at play here? The United States is working with Australia, Japan, and India to create a bloc, right, that puts pressure on China, which is, at this point, if you don't consider them, like calling them a rising power is almost starting to get to the point where it's outdated, right? They are a major global player. They play politics and global politics very differently than the United States. You look at what they're calling, vaccine diplomacy. While the United States is spending all of its time implementing a regime of intellectual property, right? Which actually go back to the other question, very much is imposed on the rest of the world through the IMF. And that is imposed on the rest of the world because the United States wants it to be imposed on the rest of the world. While the United States is doing that to make sure that private corporations here can make as much money as possible on supposedly, on something that's supposed to solve a global pandemic, China's doing something very different where they are providing for other countries with, needed vaccines. So the United States is trying to work with, Australia, India, and Japan to put as much pressure on China as possible. Internationally, I think that India, Japan, and Australia probably don't like how bellicose the United States is getting, because obviously it's a lot easier for the United States to beat its chest about China if you're not, as close, for example, as India and Japan are, obviously, and very much in that part of the world as Australia is, more than the United States. I don't think that they probably like how bellicose it's been getting. But it's something, so that's the international. So we'll see how far they can push it. But the United States is making it very clear to any kind of observers that they're going to try to push this as far as possible. Domestically, I think and that's one of the areas that we have more control over this. It comes out of, a horrific increase in, anti-Asian violence and rhetoric and attacks. I mean, and that emanates from cultural and historical aspects of the United States. I think some people try to put too much of that just on like political rhetoric from from politicians is incorrect. But there's no doubt about it that you have a guy who's calling it the China virus for the past year plays into that, and the opposition party, their opponents, really haven't distinguished from them materially or rhetorically. Very much so, they were doing the opposite, actually saying that Trump was too soft on China, right? So if you're a hawk, if you're somebody whose interest is actually like increasing violence and increasing, tensions with China, it is a, it is a perfect storm. All right, I'm taking questions for folks who just jumped in too, so feel free to to ask them, and always appreciate super chats. Appreciate Kowalski. Thanks so much, brother. I'm curious how you're moving. Aren't you doing jumping into politics there? I'm curious how that's going. Joffrey asked, have you been influenced by West Texan philosopher and activist Rick Roderick? Sorry if someone's asked this already. I like Rick Roderick a lot. Highly suggest his lectures. His lectures on existentialism are phenomenal. His Nietzsche lectures are very interesting. I mean, he's the man. He's an incredible teacher. I don't know too much about Rick Roderick's like personal philosophical work. I know about him more as like an instructor of of kind of continental philosophy, which is a treat because so many American philosophers don't really delve into continental philosophy like that. So I very much always appreciate Rick Roderick. For folks who aren't familiar, he's a big old West Texas boy. He has a real draw, and he just gives these great lectures. You can find him on YouTube on Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir, and all these other folks. He's a real one for sure, and he's very interesting. He was very progressive for his time, like socially. It's interesting to hear some of his interviews. Highly suggest checking that out. William says, you said in the last post game you'd welcome more suggestions of patrons on topics, which is the best place to put suggestions to you. You can comment on Patreon. You can send us a message. You can send me a DM on Twitter. Always around. I'm pretty accessible. Facebook's the worst place to get in touch with us, though. I just gotta say. Let me see. Hey, let's see. Matt Faint says, Australia has been very keen on beating its chest about China, and the Chinese government has been disciplining them with trade changes, increasingly barley tariffs and dropping Australian coal. I know some of the rhetoric I see from folks in Australia, it's pretty interesting when it comes. I mean, I don't know. Again, like I'm very interested in Australia. I have some good friends in Brisbane and other parts of the country. But I don't know too much about like that. And obviously, Ange. But I don't know too much about what's going on the ground. But what I see sometimes can be pretty wild. Anti-Asian rhetoric. Specifically attacking people for their ethnicity who are trying to get involved. With politics, which is certainly horrifying. All right, let's see. So Mario says, have you read about Denmark's no refugees policy? So I'm aware of it, but I haven't looked into it too much. Definitely an insane development, and this is the kind of right-wing movement that we're seeing across the globe, which is something that we shouldn't take lightly at all. Yeah. Oh, this is a good one. Charles Raintree says, shout out to John Prine, an heir to outlaw country. Can you explain to me, let's put a period on that because, yeah, John Prine's the man. Everyone should check out his music if you haven't listened to him. So Charles asks, can you explain to me what a reactionary is? That's a good question. I think the way to describe a reactionary would be it's somebody who is seeing progress in society and they actually want to scrap it and to undo it, right? That's the kind of most general. So basically they're seeing change and you see change as inherently like a very bad thing, would be the way that it's used by most lefties, right? So Trump's politics are reactionary, right? They're reactionary because they're seeing, gains for certain groups in society and they want to claw that back, right? Like that's how you would define a reactionary's politics. Dave asked, "What is happening with Venezuela under the Biden administration?" I mean, the same old shit too. There, I mean, they've been pushing against Guaido. Sorry, they've been not pushing against. They've been trying to bring Guaido back into the public eye, which is hilarious. This guy's like seems like just complete failure. Does not have on the ground support, but just continues to show up in parks across the country and demand a coup. The Biden administration is continuing that kind of nonsense. The Biden administration has been, to go back to what we were saying a second ago, extremely reactionary too on Bolivia and on Ecuador. They've been beating their chest. I mean, we talked with Daniel Bessner early on, I think in January, about what we thought the Joe Biden foreign policy was going to be, and you can't make, it's hard to make predictions, but I think the general consensus was, it could go a couple different ways. One of the more dangerous would be if Biden just sort of lets the blob or the apparatus take control. And it seems very clearly that, the state, the bureaucrats and folks like that are very much calling the shots. Not that Joe Biden cares about other countries or anything like that. Don't get me wrong, but it seems very much that, the people who have interests in, and have spent their whole career just, supporting American imperialism and opposing any kind of people's government around the world, very much are the people who are having the most political influence right now. All right, y'all. I want to make sure I talk a little bit about this will thing before I head out. I might take a couple questions too, so feel sure to drop those in. But I just wanted to talk about this, and this has been a little bit of a theme of these streams and also some of the work that we've been doing on the show, which is talking about this question of will, right? And I don't want people to misunderstand this and to think that these things are about the question of like will, and talking about politics in this way is about like preventing us from being able to blame folks or to talk about people's like personalities or like their actual rhetorical choices. That's not what this is about. But there's this kind of misunderstanding of politics that I see more and more and more, especially as there's so many people who are becoming radicalized and they are getting frustrated with a lack of results, right? And I don't think we should be complacent with things or anything like that. But if you think the reason we don't have the kind of politics that we, aspire to is because of a lack of will from politicians, you're making a big mistake. Because if we were to sweep, if tomorrow morning, a lot of, we had like some, a bunch of these progressives, which, they're squishy, they're not socialists, they're not necessarily our enemies, but most of these progressives do not share the criticism of capitalism that we do. They want to fix and alleviate some people's suffering in some areas, right? And we can work with them on things like that, right? But it's not, if you think that if you call yourself a progressive capitalist, then you are not somebody who shares my worldview. You are not somebody who recognizes that the things that you are upset about that make you a progressive are caused by a system that is designed to put profit over all other things and constantly obscures very clear relations. Think about things like housing, right? We have enough housing in this country to house everybody, but because we live in capitalism, which needs everything to have an exchange value to treat everything like a commodity, we have a system where people live on the street, even though we actually as a society have enough structures to take care of everybody, right? That is a decision that comes from upholding a system, and that system is capitalism, right? So if you think that you can be a capitalist, if you're a capitalist, sooner or later, you're going to have to come either to realizations that you maybe aren't a capitalist, or you're going to make a decision that say like, I am willing to accept, suffering to maintain a certain economic program, right? And there's all different versions of capitalists when it comes to like their actual personal political beliefs. But sooner or later, you're either living in bad faith and not understanding what you mean when you say that you're a progressive capitalist or whatever, or there is a moment where you will say, I will actually choose maintaining a system of private profit. I will maintain a system that allows some people to be extremely rich while other people live in poverty, right? There comes a time where you make a decision there, right? And they're telling us. So anyways, I just think that that's one thing that needs to be clear. Their problem right there is like fundamentally a level of like analysis and not necessarily a question of will. The will's a part of it, but it's just like it's something that you can get stuck in a rabbit hole. And to put some meat on this, let me pull. I'm sorry, I can't pull up. Share things with y'all. But do you remember this guy Scott Santons or whatever? He was a big UBI guy, big Andrew Yang dude, and he made a bunch of videos against me and Michael when we were criticizing Andrew Yang's Trojan horse plan when it came to UBI. But this is a great example of this kind of will question or this lack of like structural analysis, because you see this a lot, especially from UBI folks. But it's also like there's like leftish, progressive, not socialist pundits who make this argument, to like even centrists like TED Talks. Make this argument that poverty is a choice, and they don't mean like personal choice. They're saying like a societal choice, that we don't have to deal with a question of scarcity, but rather this is a question of political will. And to like cite their argument fundamentally is like there are enough resources to take care of everybody. So our failure to do that is a question of political will, right? And I was just saying that a second ago, right? It is important to make it clear to people that there is nothing natural about this system. This is a human system. It's a created system. We can provide for folks. Poverty is a human created condition today. There is no disagreement there, right? And this is something that I think we can maybe do some work on, building that basic understanding. Like we agree that these are created problems. But what often happens is some people make the mistake when they say, oh, this is a created problem, so that must mean that it's a problem of will. And that's where you fall into a kind of analytic, like a disaster when you're making your analysis, because then you think, okay, well, if we just change hearts and minds of the people in power, then things are going to get different, right? And that's like a big belief of people who want to like maintain capitalism as like the major mode of production in this society, right? As the economic doctrine of the society. But they say, okay, but we'll do a fix here. So we'll have a stronger welfare state. Oh, we'll give people UBI. So we'll alleviate some of the tensions that come out of capitalism while still maintaining the system and its engine, right? One that is bad analysis. Not that we shouldn't fight for these kind of things when we can win them, but it is nowhere near a solution to these problems, because capitalism will always fight to undermine those systems. Anything that alleviates conditions for working people is a threat to capitalists. Depending on the conditions, the capitalists might be willing to allow folks to have more rights or security, right? But they're always willing to roll that back. The United States is a great example of that. You see massive labor militancy. You see a massive economic disaster in this country. The capitalist class, gets hit very hard, and they accept significant conditions that led to the building of the American welfare state, right? This is New Deal. This is, to a certain extent, like the Great Society. What has been the history of, American social democracy since then? A constant unwinding of those systems, because you can't have working people live in a system where they have these needs met, right? Because they need not just scarcity. Capitalists need to create artificial scarcity, right? But they also need to create fear and precarity. And you do that, one, by destroying workers' rights to organize legally. You also do it by making housing something that is extremely unaffordable, so that you have to constantly be at fear of eviction, and also fear of your landlord, so that you don't really have the confidence or the ability in a lot of ways to stand up against unfair conditions. So that means you're going to be less likely to complain as an individual about your working conditions, your wages, and things like that, because you don't have enough money in the bank to survive if you have to go without work for like 2 to 3 weeks, right? You create a subservient, or not subservient is the wrong word. You create a working class that is very much afraid to take a stand for themselves, right? And you do that at the same time undermining solidarity, undermining labor unions, things like that, right? That's been the history, in the United States, because capital is always going to roll back those reforms. This is not an argument saying that we should not pursue reforms and pursue things that alleviate people's conditions too. That's where some people on the other side of this get crazy as well, because they think that the only thing that is worth doing is full communism. That's never been how any communist movement has worked, by the way, or socialist movement has worked and gained power, by the way. But that is a trend that we have to acknowledge and to push back against. So what do we do here? It's a lot of work. We've talked about party building. We've talked about other things on this channel. The first thing that people need to understand is that these aren't questions about will or good capitalism versus bad capitalism. These are systemic to the capitalist system. The conditions change, which allow us to do different things, right? So when the conditions change and we're able to get stronger workers' protections, have a higher minimum wage, do things like that, then that's important. But what's really critical and what can last a lot longer, right? Because this is a long fight. Is taking what they call non-reformist reforms, right? Where you're able to take things out of the market. So for example, taking healthcare out of the market relation. So it's not a private system anymore. It's not a for-profit system anymore. It's not a system that is governed by the logic of capitalism. It's a system that is governed by the logic of human need. That's a huge victory. One, because it will benefit a lot of people and improve their lives. But two, because it takes an incredibly powerful part of our life and our society out of the hands of the ruling class, right? That's a victory. You do the same thing with vibrant public housing. You look at Red Vienna, right? Vienna has one of a great history of public housing, that came from socialists, and communism, right? So that even today, as that system has had regressions, right? So it's just like a free market system now, right? You still have people who are able to house themselves in this public. Something like 55% of the units in Vienna are public housing, right? Like you have something that is taken out of that kind of cruelty of the market relation and is into something different, which allows us, one, to focus our energies towards different problems, but two, those are things that are harder to just override. If you create an entire system and a community of people that expect this as something that a city government provides for you, you're in a stronger position, right? So again, you have to think structurally about these questions, so that we can find ways to win, right? And to think structurally about them is to start to think about, okay, politics is not just about having the right or wrong answer on questions. Politics is about trying to find ways to build movements that have the viability to survive, one in the long term, but also have the vision to be engaged in politics on all spheres of life, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to win, right? We need to have, political movements that have a strong critique and understanding of like the repressive state apparatus, so that's policing. We need to have political movements that have strong understandings of, healthcare and, education, and like what we want to be doing about that, so that we're not having to convince the entire working class about every political question that we face. And obviously, the way that you do that, the only way that you do that, is to build class consciousness, to have people in a society of millions who have all different kinds of cultures and interests and beliefs, to understand themselves as, hey, I might be, a Texans fan. I might be, into this band. I might be from this part of the country, right? But I'm also a worker, and I have a hell of a lot more in common with somebody in Maine than I do with the rich asshole down the street, right? Like, that is the kind of consciousness that we have to build, and that has to be funneled and will only be built through political education, but also fundamentally through party building, organization building, right? And you're not going to get to that place if you think that politics is all just a question of, well, I hope I was able to hit some things there. And, I'll definitely keep coming back to that. But it's just like this will thing is frustrating, because I see a lot of sloppy analysis from folks, who are on our team. But they're always talking about, like, oh, we need to, convince Democrats to have a back. It's like, we all know what the Democratic Party is. It is an organization that is meant to prevent left-wing movements from coming to power, right? A whole other conversation about how we're going to deal with that party, and we've done a lot of that, and we'll continue to do that, right? But if you think that this is just a question of will, and that's your critique, then you also don't understand what the Democratic Party is, and you don't understand what our opponents are either, right? These things are very deep, and we have a hard task ahead of us. But if we continue to get distracted in this kind of thing, we're just going to wake everybody up one day, right, with some big movement and some big march. That's not how politics works. You have to have the people who can organize that kind of thing, and two, that can channel that energy. There are constantly going to be moments where people get fed up and they participate in spectacle in public, right? That happens all the time, right? We saw that happen last summer, when people were saying, we're fed up with police brutality in this country, right? But if you don't have these kind of organizations that can capture that motivation, right, then we won't be able to change those fundamental parts of society that create these crises. Enough of me. Let me get some of these questions. So JT says, is replicating the Nevada strategy the strategy moving forward? So in Nevada, basically, lefties and Bernie folks were able to take over the party. I think that's definitely, it's worthwhile. Like, if there's any opportunity to take the weapons of our opponents and to use them and to control them, right? I think that's worthwhile. I don't think the answer, though, is for me to sit here on the stream and say, okay, the job of the socialist left right now is to infiltrate state parties across the U.S. I think fundamentally we need to start talking seriously about that party question. And I'm not the only one saying this. This is very much a part of the debates of big left-wing organizations, like the DSA. Obviously Jackman has covered the party question a lot as well. So, we'll be covering, so there's a lot of stuff about this. Maybe we could talk. I know, like, there's a lot of people who have done some, questions about, like, the dirty break, right? The dirty break, for folks who aren't familiar, is this idea that, we continue to do, what we're doing now, where you have, like, AOC folks, but AOC's obviously attention, because she's like in the DSA, but she's not really, she doesn't take orders from the organization anymore, or anything like that. But, like, the idea is, like, to continue to get more and more progressives, and then eventually drop and create a new left-wing third party. Okay. I am reading some things. It's been a little bit. I might be heading out in a second too, because I was supposed to only do a short one. Thanks, Joanna. We appreciate everything. Thanks so much, Joanna. I'm excited. Sorry. I know y'all can't read this at the same time. Joanna says, looking forward to you and Jason on Jackman tomorrow. I am too. It's gonna be a fun conversation. And Joanna is a great booster and supporter of this show. We really appreciate all of your support, and also helping out people recognize the great work that Jason's been doing too, because I very much think his stuff is great. All right. Let me see. I might be heading out in a second. We're going to be talking basketball. Sorry, whoever's mad about that. With Big Waz on Thursday. We're also going to be talking with Shama Sawant about, the the corporate move to to recall her, and Seattle politics, and also where we're at in the left. I think that's gonna be a good conversation. I'm looking forward to that as well. As always, I appreciate all of y'all. We'll be releasing these thinker talks soon. If there's anybody that you are interested in us covering, or people you might want to have us interview, please reach out. You can reach out to us on Patreon. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook. Please don't. I'm just not going to get that. And support us on patreon.com/leftreckoning. Really appreciate you all in the community. And let's talk soon. Take care.